Okay, hi everybody. Today is Tuesday, August 29th. You are being recorded to YouTube for this week's SIG Testing weekly meeting. Pretty light agenda this week. We're going to talk a little bit about how things are going on Prow for all the things. Desires to move away from Jenkins and Munch GitHub. This is basically just going to be rambling off the cuff, and maybe Ryan or other folks who have some knowledge can maybe chip in. And then some discussion about labels and whatever else happens to come up organically. So first off, I think like Ben's little comic that he posted in the SIG testing Slack a little earlier, maybe it was yesterday, like only Prow, no Munch GitHub, only Prow was awesome. That's totally the spirit of this team right now. So to recap briefly, right? Prow is given a GitHub event, do a thing. Munch GitHub is sweep around GitHub things in a loop and munch them, whatever that means. And Munch GitHub has been an organically maintained code base that's passed across a number of owners and hasn't been super well maintained. And Ryan and Cole Wagner have been doing a fantastic job of making it a little more operational. But I guess maybe unsaid, it's actually unclear to me whether it's documented in the code or in the README, is this intent to, as much as possible, stop using Munch GitHub and instead move all of the function, either like any new functionality that we add or migrate existing functionality that we are still actively depending on to Prow, given that Prow seems to have been designed a little bit more upfront instead of evolved organically, and seems to be operating on a more operationally friendly and scalable basis than Munch GitHub does. Although really there have been, I think, some good improvements made that have reduced the pain level for Munch GitHub. As far as I can tell, the main reason you want something in Munch GitHub today is the convenience of being able to use the code that deals with owners and approvers. As far as I know, that stuff doesn't exist in Prow today. The other reason that used to exist, but I believe is no longer relevant, is Munch GitHub's ability to maintain like a shared cache of Git and GitHub related information. Does that sound about right, Ryan? Because I think I had heard an intent to potentially front either or both of these with some kind of external service that could act as a shared cache. But right now, it's this thing that lives in memory in Munch GitHub, and that's actually the portion that is why the submit queue takes so long to restart and why we've been making efforts to, as much as possible, have Munch GitHub pull from config maps and make individual components like reload themselves or get notified that the config map has changed rather than restarting the entire process and then requiring that whole cache to get filled back up.
And we actually did split out the submit queue from the other mungers so that we could restart one without the other being affected as well. And most of the mungers would be applicable as event-based, but some of them are inherently scanning. For example, the needs rebase, some of the this hasn't been touched in so long, those ones. But we've had some success where we have someone on our team that wrote a thing to scrape all of the bugs that were open, all the open issues on GitHub for all the Kubernetes repos. And he used GraphQL and he managed to do it all in about 300 tokens and 10 minutes, I think, as a daily sort of report for figuring out what needs to be acted on and everything. So it's possible that more of the mungers that are currently in Munch GitHub that do something each day could be moved over to a GraphQL query that would get all their data in a efficient manner and be a separate cron job or something like that. And the one other concern I had was we need to figure out the monitoring and logging, because if we split everything out of Munch GitHub, then all of a sudden the logs will be split around too. But that's a general problem we have with lots of our infrastructure where if it breaks, we don't have great alerting right now. We just need to get that set up.
Yeah. Is it possible you could provide a link to that GraphQL thing? I think that would be a really useful example to
Um, I
copy
don't
from.
know if it's actually in the open source just yet. I'll have a look.
Because oh, go for it, Josh.
Sorry, I thought you were done. A quick question about the GraphQL queries. Are those GraphQL queries against the GitHub API, GitHub API, GraphQL API, or against a cached backing store that is not backed by GitHub directly, but
It's
is
against the GitHub GraphQL API, but we find that when you use GraphQL and you ask for exactly what you need, you can avoid basically quadratic explosions in a lot of places,
Mhm.
and it's just a lot more efficient overall.
Yeah, that's really cool. So you touched upon one thing that I just organically noticed or raised, and I know an issue has been created. I don't know where the follow-up is, but yeah, one thing I used to use to check the health of the submit queue was to go look at Velodrome and look at that like metrics page, and it showed the submit queue loop frequency. And as soon as we split the two instances up, suddenly the submit queue loop frequency was just like as high as it could go, which was great until I realized I now no longer know how frequently all of the other mungers are running. And so I think there was at least an effort to take the HTTP server that exposes the metrics endpoint and take that out of the submit queue munger and turn it into a feature that other things could list as a requirement. And I think that opens up the gateway to exposing potentially more metrics than just submit queue loop frequency if we find that Punch GitHub is still a thing we're going to be leaning on going forward. Something else, I guess, is a general design philosophy that you touched on there, Ryan, is it seems like Punch GitHub is a place where a couple like state machine type of processes exist. So you like scrape through the comment stream of an existing issue or pull request, and from that you sort of transition through the state machine to decide, yes, this issue is approved, or hey, this thing needs to be rebased or whatever. And I'm wondering if I can't think of a technical reason why those couldn't be implemented as prow other than state living in memory. Does that sound right?
Yeah, those ones where it's a comment stream, you need to figure out if this is okay to test based on a previous approval or things like that. Those are quite easy to do in Prow. We have enough tokens, we can just ask for comments. So anything where the event is driven by a human, the number of human-driven events is low enough that we can generally do requests for it. It's the other state machines where it's some commit happened that would cause a rebase. That's not instantly available. We have to query a GitHub for it. It's kind of expensive. Those things where it's a time-based or uncorrelated events are the more difficult state machines to migrate over. But there are only a few of those. The vast majority of them are not necessary for the for the very stateful approach in Munch GitHub. And obviously, the less state we have to maintain, the less there is the cold cache effect whenever things change and everything like that.
So I have some recent experience having just implemented a munger. I guess maybe people didn't notice until it was too late because I've been told to do everything in Prow. But I think one of the nice things about Munge GitHub is that if I write a munger, it runs both event-driven and time-driven. Like there'll be a once-a-day resync. And I think that it sounds like Prow is definitely the way forward, but just there's a lot of niceties that Munge GitHub has that I think Prow needs to make the development of new plugins easier for someone who's uninitiated. Because if you try to do it and you're like, oh, it doesn't, capability like say shared repo state doesn't exist, I'd have to implement that before I implement my plugin, or I could write a munger. So there's kind of, even though we don't want to write more mungers, it's like it's actually easier to write some mungers than Prow plugins until some of the functionality is moved over to Prow.
Yeah, and especially the backfilling. We don't have a great story for that just yet in Prow.
One question I had as well on that note, I noticed, so in the Prow stuff, we're not using the GitHub API library, seem to be reinventing a bunch of those API interactions. What's the rationale behind that? What was the design there?
I think the GitHub API library didn't support some of the review comments things, and we started out using only a very small fraction of it, and now it's like we're halfway there, and I don't know what's.
I would second that question. I mean, I'm looking at I need like the milestone from an issue, and that's supported on the Munger side, but I'd have to add support to that on the Prow side, it appears.
Typically, I think this is probably a great follow-up question for Joe Finney, since I view him as more or less the principal architect, or at least the person who wrote a lot of this. So maybe some of the design decisions or intent are still in his head instead of in a document somewhere. I always read into it as we're trying to keep the number of dependencies for Prow very, very tiny. And so by being very explicit about what each plugin needs as far as its level of GitHub interaction or Kubernetes action, that made them a little more composable or separable. But we may be at a point where that doesn't necessarily make sense going forward.
I think there's needs to be, I mean, I guess when you're starting out and your use cases are super simple, that sort of lowest common denominator thing makes sense. But as you get more and more plugins with more functionality, I think that there's a need for a certain amount of framework to share development work amongst plugins rather than duplicating the effort.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think there's probably an element of cart before horse, where if we really do have the momentum, then it might be worth looking at what framework could look like. And now we have a better idea of what pieces are useful. But I think largely what I'm hearing is we're getting close to an inflection point where it would behoove us to have some kind of roadmap or plan for exactly when and how we're proceeding forward. I believe that the best we have at the moment is an issue that I put in the 2017 goals milestone that said we'd like to migrate all of the non-repo specific mungers out of Munge GitHub and into Prow. Separately, we've had a number of contributors external to Google who've been using Prow and Munge GitHub and Kubernetes on their own and have been submitting issues to make them more reusable. But to Josh's original question of like, what does it take for us to fully transition off of Prow, or for those areas where it makes more sense to use Munge GitHub, like what does that end goal kind of look like? And at least for me, it's kind of come down to an issue of bandwidth that I'm trying to sort of help us kick the vision can down the road just far enough for us to iterate. And it seems like we're reaching the point where it's time to go through that effort again, possibly as part of our 1.9 planning. I think in the very short term, something that Jace would probably be really interested in is whether anybody from this team is planning on making any significant changes to our testing infrastructure while we have code freeze and release burn down ongoing in like the next couple of weeks. I would anticipate that we probably want to keep things stable, and any significant changes would best be withheld or at least very widely broadcast and discussed. How do people feel about that? And does anybody know about anything coming down the road?
Are you more worried about like end user functionality changes or generally changes to components? Because I had planned some work on making Kubernetes a little bit more configurable, but none of that would necessarily lead to a lot of changes in how people interact with the service.
So in general, I would rather we be allowed to continue doing our work and stuff. Like the big bright line example to me would be if suddenly we decide to start using something brand new like Tide instead of the submit queue to do all of our merging, right? That would be kind of an unexpected change. So the release team is kind of used to the status quo right now as far as the way in which things are tested and moved through the submit queue and how code freeze is implemented and things of that nature. And if we foresee any changes to that stuff, it's worth being extra vocal about it and a little more prudent about whether or not it makes sense to do that. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Caleb also mentioned that, like he said, anything that could destabilize the queue. I know that some of the changes to how the submit queue talks to or looks at issues with do not merge labels, that some of the work that I did there has like some potential in changing how submit queue works. But I do think we're isolated in that we I mean, we can A, not update the configuration for these things, and B, not deploy them. I don't know what the feeling is on keeping like latent changes in the repo until the release cycle is over, but
Yeah,
continue development there.
I think Eric's little guidelines in the chat there of like Kubernetes changes or things that are display oriented are probably low risk. The label change that potentially changes how we withhold pull requests from being merged is medium risk, but I think we have plenty of time to get that implemented. And then, yeah, the actual mechanics of the submit queue itself would be high risk. Jace, you're unmuted. Do you want to say something there?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I'm less opposed to changes as long as we understand where and how to get our signal. So if we have a really strong communication loop about changes, I'm not necessarily opposed to it. But for me, it's really, do I have the tools to, in any given moment, assess what the health of the submit queue is or the health of the release or those things. So that's really where I personally draw the line. But that's, I mean, I think Eric's guidelines are good. UI changes are not so impactful, but if there is something that is important to change, or just, drop a note in the release Slack and let us know. It's really not that big of a deal.
I would say historically, the things that have bit us have been largely around like kube test changes and refactoring how Bootstrap is working, or migrating jobs to use flags instead of environment variables. I feel like that's sort of the extreme risk. And so I still think actually we haven't developed it'd be nice if we could do better about announcing kube test changes. Some way of communicating that, especially to the release teams, that they know. We do now, one thing is we do now show in the test grid, there's the commit for the Kubernetes repo at the top, and then below that is a commit for the test infra. So if we do update the image, that'll show a change in the test infra commit, which should provide something of a signal. But yeah, if we do change it, I agree with you. We should be better about providing you with some way of understanding that.
Yeah, that's exactly where I was thinking, Eric. Thank you for fuzzy brain today. But because those were sort of the changes where it's like, oh, well, we're just sort of refactoring and changing schemas and migrating flags around. You shouldn't care about any of that. But sometimes there were, accidents or typos or whatever, oopsies that caused like whole swaths of thing to fail. And so just like being verbose, I think, is the key thing there. On your comment about showing the test infra commit underneath of the Kubernetes commit, I had noticed that a little while ago, but it's slightly confusing to me. Do you know if there is a way to actually display the names or like row headings, column headings, whatever for each of those things? Because it seems like you just kind of have to know at the moment. Like I click through and I line up those values to what's in Kubernetes to figure out, oh, that's what that SHA is. Okay.
Right. Yeah. We should add that to test. The test grid doesn't have that ability right now, but we should add it.
Okay, cool. But we do at least have that second row of commit hashes. So if those change and everything goes right along with it, that's a pretty high signal there. Cool.
Yeah, it's definitely tribal knowledge only right now.
A little bit. I think one other thing, just to try and close the loop on the Prow versus Jenkins thing. My understanding for why Jenkins is still involved is because we use Docker containers to manage all of the dependencies of a given build environment. And we do not wish to run those. So the build scripts basically create a Docker container and all the dependencies are in that, and then they run things inside of that container, which means if we were to have this happen on Prow, we would need to allow the Prow job to connect to the Docker daemon on the node that is actually running the Prow job, which we don't want to do because that's a publicly exposed node. And we don't trust the Docker and Docker approach to provide sufficient fidelity. So instead, if we could use Bazel to manage all of our dependencies, we no longer need to run a Docker image for all of the build dependencies to be correct. So the use of Bazel is pretty much the last thing that's holding us back from migrating everything off of Jenkins. And that's actively ongoing, hopefully a 1.9 thing, I think. Did I get that right?
Ben, do you want to, yeah, that sounds right to me, but Ben, is there anything you want to, I know you're refactoring some of the jobs to sort of use Bazel. Is there anything, if you're listening, I don't know if you're listening, but. You're unmuted.
You're unmuted, but we can't hear anything.
Ah.
I noticed, oh, wait.
Okay. Yeah, there's a physical mute button as well. All right. Not in particular. Bazel builds seem to mostly work fine right now. Hopefully soon, some of the PR E2Es will be using Bazel builds.
Well, what are you doing?
There's going to be there's a Bazel. I separated Bazel build and Bazel test on the PRs, and the E2E jobs are going to do a run after success on the Bazel build and use that build. So it's just like logging where the build goes.
Oh, our 10 pre-submit jobs all build the same version of Kubernetes 10 times. And so instead, we're going to sort of have it more like a tree where we have just one Bazel build, and then all of our EDE jobs are just going to extract that already built thing and then launch the cluster using that. And so that will allow us to move all the pre-submit jobs off of Jenkins. There's still something we're going to have to tackle in 1.9, which may include also the pre-submit jobs. But there's also a bunch of weird jobs, like I think the node jobs do. There's various jobs that do weird things, and those weird things we haven't migrated yet. So I think like the C advisor jobs and the node EDEs, and I don't know about KubeMark, but there's various things that are not yet migrated, but almost everything on the CI side has been migrated.
That's really cool. Josh, did that answer sort of your question?
Yes, that answered several questions and then answered other questions before I could even ask them. So thank you, everyone who's the brain dump is much appreciated. I'm still getting my head wrapped around all the pieces. So just to follow up on some things that were said earlier, it sounds like to me the Bazel builds will eliminate the need for any sort of Docker and Docker, which will therefore eliminate the need for having the Jenkins be involved at all. Even to be kicked off by prod jobs, because those would be Bazel builds instead, hypothetically. The other issue that was mentioned was the lack of backfill, because Prow's inherent event-driven stateless nature. There would need to be some sort of backfill mechanism, some sort of, and also a time-based event firing. Maybe that's just something that literally just does some munging and then fires off the equivalent events or something. What would be the follow-up, the next action on that? Is there an issue, or should there be an issue, or more discussion, or also the other thing before I forget is the GraphQL API calls that were able to eliminate some munging in favor of Prow. It wasn't clear to me if that was something that hadn't been open sourced yet, or something that was being a work in progress, or whatever.
That was a fantastic summary. Thank you.
On the time-based stuff, I saw the conversation went into basically create a pod config and run it as a cron job on Kubernetes.
Yeah, I didn't have time to catch up on that scroll back, but I mean, just not being quite as deep as into Prow as some of you are, it was a little unclear to me, cron job versus Prow periodic job, why you wanted to use one versus the other, what those afforded you, that sort of thing. Because I guess I'm sort of trying to look through it of the lens of like Prow should be used to schedule all the things, as opposed to using Prow to schedule some stuff and then the Kubernetes cron job to schedule other stuff a different way. But at the same time, maybe a cron job is more Kubernetes native, and that makes more sense. So.
Wait, I thought you couldn't schedule something in Prow. That was why you'd be using the cron job, because I thought Prow was purely reactive, event-driven.
So there's a triggers plugin, and it's got pre-submit, post-submit, and periodic stanzas. And I believe periodic doesn't do straight up cron. Actually, now that I say this out loud, it just says run these prow jobs on a periodic interval, like every 2 hours, every 3 hours. Like for example, the big queries that Eric Feda wrote to compute the flakiest jobs for the last week run on a daily basis, and those are kicked off as periodic prow jobs. Right. It's about trust. Could you elaborate on that, Eric?
So there's the prow cluster, then there's the prow builds cluster. Since the builds cluster is running untrusted test code, we don't want that to have access to any credentials that have write access to the Kubernetes repo. And so that's the main, and right now there's not a way to have prow choose which cluster it schedules into. So theoretically we could have some, protection to make sure that none of our untrusted code is running on the same code as a periodic munger type thing. But we haven't built that yet. So essentially, if your job needs to run periodically and needs access to GitHub credentials, then you need to run it as a cron job that schedules in a cluster that has access to write credentials. Whereas like the retester, all it does is leave a comment. So it's basically just like a random internet user. So for that, we can run that as a periodic job, or if it just needs credentials to a GCP project, to create a VM or something. All of that can happen in the build cluster that's with, minimally trusted code. But if we don't want to have someone to be able to, write code that does things to the main repos.
Okay, that clarifies a lot, and it does sound like it'd be, so right now the path for migrating many of the mungers that like write labels and stuff, those need a GitHub token to be able to write those labels, and so we can't actually turn those into periodic prow jobs. Those are actually just completely separate from prow entirely. And it would be cool if we could do those as periodics, but the thing that's holding us back there is the ability to schedule to a trusted cluster versus an untrusted cluster. Okay, thank you. That clarified quite a bit for me anyway. We are actually at time, even though I didn't think we had anything to talk about. Steve, you raised a couple questions about changing labels and the scope of Kubernetes. How would we feel about maybe having a Kubernetes discussion, a Kubernetes-centric discussion next week?
Yeah, that should be fine. I just figured if we had time, we could bring it up. I can probably also send a note out to the testing mailing list. I just didn't want it to happen on a GitHub issue.
Yeah, and maybe get some people from Istio talking about that too.
Yeah. Josh, thanks a bunch for the suggestion. Like a lot of this stuff could stand to be written down and documented instead of so tribal, but at least having it recorded on YouTube is slightly better. Because I think this has been the clearest articulation or snapshot of our roadmap for a little bit. Eric, you were going to say something?
What did people think about the integration testing meeting that we had out of band of this meeting? Like, did we like that? I mean, maybe this could be something we sort of gather together some interested Kubernetes folks and hold a meeting, later this week.
That would be cool, but I personally don't have the bandwidth for it this week.
Yeah, I mean, if we have a platform to do that on, I think that would be fine.
I guess more, my question was, do we like the only, we can talk on the email list and on Slack and GitHub issues, but do we like to have the possibility of, meeting other places?
I definitely feel like the face-to-face stuff is more productive, or has the potential to be a lot more productive. So I would definitely value that. Yeah,
totally. Scheduling informal stuff, working group stuff is always appreciated. Sure, that's a good pattern.
Very cool, thanks.
All right, Cool. Thank you everybody for your time, and look forward to seeing you next week. Take it easy.
Thanks, everybody. Bye.
Oh, and I'll put those GraphQL queries on the Slack.
Okay, thanks.